In the darkest corners of medieval history lies a wedding ritual so disturbing, most historians refuse to speak of it. Imagine this: a king crowned with ultimate power, yet on his wedding night, he did not claim his bride. Instead, he ordered her into the arms of his most trusted minister. Why? Was it a test of loyalty, a cruel tradition, or something far more sinister? For centuries, this hidden practice has been buried in silence, until now. What you are about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about kings, brides, and the true darkness of power. In the heart of medieval Europe, where shadows ruled longer than daylight and fear was a language spoken fluently in every corner of the kingdom, there lived a monarch whose name carried both reverence and terror. His reign stretched across fertile valleys and desolate highlands, binding together diverse peoples beneath the iron weight of his crown. Yet behind the walls of his palace, behind the gilded halls and towering spires, there existed a darkness deeper than any battlefield, a darkness born not of swords and blood alone, but of rituals so twisted they were whispered only in silence, carried on the lips of servants who dared not be heard. This was no ordinary king. He was a ruler, forged in cruelty, molded by a childhood of violence and a youth of suspicion. The court chroniclers praised his victories, his taxation, his laws, but none wrote openly of the secrets hidden behind his throne. Those who came too close to the truth were rewarded not with gold but with exile, or worse, with a quiet disappearance. The streets of the capital had learned to fear the night, for when the royal guards moved in silence, it was often a family of dissenters that vanished before dawn. The people bowed deeply in his presence, not out of love, but because to stand tall in his gaze was to invite ruin. The palace itself reflected his reign. It rose like a mountain of stone, its towers stabbing the sky as though to remind heaven itself who ruled the earth. The windows were narrow, made for archers rather than sunlight, and the halls were long corridors of echoing footsteps, lined with portraits of ancestors who watched in judgment from their painted prisons. The great hall glowed with torchlight, but even there shadows stretched like fingers across the walls, reaching for those who dared to speak without permission. Among these shadows grew the whispers of a ritual, older than his crown, darker than his wars. The peasants spoke of it in taverns, their words drowned quickly in ale lest anyone overhear. The ministers knew of it too, though none dared question its meaning, for tradition in this kingdom was as binding as chains. It was said that on the wedding night of the king, when the kingdom celebrated union, the bride would not first share the marriage bed with her husband. Instead, she was delivered into the chambers of another, his most trusted minister. Some claimed it was an ancient rite of loyalty, a way for the king to prove that no man was above his command. Others believed it was a curse, a legacy born of the king's ancestors, who once feared betrayal so deeply they turned intimacy into a weapon of control. But no one truly knew the truth. The only certainty was that every royal bride emerged, changed, her eyes carrying a weight that never lifted, her smile fading within days of her wedding. Some vanished into illness, others lived silently, their voices drowned beneath the echo of the throne. The king himself rarely spoke of the tradition, yet his very silence was enough to keep it alive. He believed power was not only taken on the battlefield but exercised in the most private chambers of the court. By commanding even the sacred bond between husband and wife, he reminded his ministers, his people, and his enemies that nothing, neither love nor loyalty, nor flesh itself, stood outside his authority. Beyond this ritual, his cruelty thrived in countless ways. The peasants bore the heaviest taxes, their labor feeding his armies and his luxuries. Minority groups, those of different tongues, darker skins, or foreign faiths, were pushed into the margins of society, stripped of rights and forced to serve as the lowest of servants within the palace walls. It was in their faces that the kingdom's cruelty shone most clearly, for they carried the burdens of humiliation daily, branded by difference in a world that worshipped sameness. The king saw no contradiction in such cruelty. To him, power was survival, and survival meant crushing all who might question his supremacy. The palace ministers, themselves beneficiaries of his favor, never challenged him, for to question tradition was to question the crown itself. They bowed lower. They whispered softer, and they obeyed every command, even when it turned their stomachs. Yet beneath this facade of order, cracks spread like veins through marble. Servants carried stories like invisible banners, passing them from one hand to another. A young maid whispered to her friend of what she had heard from an older nurse, the trembling sobs of the last queen on her wedding night, muffled through stone walls. A guard confessed to another that he could not look his daughter in the eyes after seeing what the ritual demanded. Even priests, sworn to uphold the sanctity of the throne, avoided the subject, their sermons growing vague whenever the king's marriages were mentioned. And so the kingdom lived under two laws, the visible written in stone and parchment, and the invisible written in blood and silence. As the years passed, the king's rule only hardened. His suspicion grew sharper, his punishments swifter, and his paranoia thicker. He surrounded himself with ministers who owed him their lives, each one hand-picked not for wisdom, but for obedience. Among them was one man who stood apart, not in loyalty, for they were all loyal, but in the depth of his connection to the king. This minister had served him since youth, their bond forged not in friendship, but in mutual necessity. The king trusted him with matters too dangerous for others, secrets too dark to leave in writing. And in this minister's hands, the ritual found its most twisted expression. The kingdom awaited the announcement of the king's new bride. Rumors spread quickly, for she was said to come from a family with foreign blood. Her skin fair, but her lineage carrying whispers of a people despised in the kingdom's hierarchy. Some celebrated her beauty, others muttered about the stain of her ancestry. For the king, her heritage mattered little. It was not love that chose her, but politics, alliances, and the relentless need to maintain his grip on power. As the wedding day approached, the streets filled with festivities. Flags of gold and crimson waved from towers, trumpets blared, and peasants danced in worn shoes, pretending joy while hunger gnawed their bellies. But beneath the music and laughter lay unease, for all knew what would follow. The kingdom's daughters whispered prayers, mothers clutched their children tighter, and fathers drank more heavily than usual. Everyone celebrated, yet everyone remembered. For though the wedding was a union of crown and nobility, the night itself belonged to the shadows, to the ritual no one dared name aloud. And so, the stage was set. The king stood tall in his iron crown. The bride prepared for a fate she did not yet fully grasp, and the minister awaited with the silence of a man who knew his role was not his choice, but his command. The torches burned brighter, the bells tolled louder, but the darkness that waited in the bridal chamber was older, heavier, and far more terrifying than any wedding song could conceal. She was spoken of as a jewel chosen to adorn the throne, yet the whispers that followed her name were heavier than the crown she would wear. The bride was young, barely stepping out of girlhood, raised in the silence of guarded halls and schooled in the arts of obedience. Her face, pale yet tinged with the warmth of a bloodline whispered to be foreign, became a subject of both fascination and suspicion. Her lineage was noble, yet not untouched by the stain of otherness. Somewhere in the tangled roots of her ancestry lay a people despised, a heritage that polite society pretended not to see, yet never forgot. She had grown beneath the watchful eyes of her mother, who taught her that survival meant silence. From her earliest days, she had been trained to move gracefully, to speak only when spoken to, and to carry herself as though the world were always watching. And indeed it always was. In her father's household, servants measured her every step, tutors corrected her every glance, and strangers judged her every gesture. To them, she was not only a noble daughter, she was a reminder that the blood of outsiders had seeped into the veins of the ruling class. Children whispered behind her back, mocking her for the curve of her features, the shade of her hair, the difference in her voice. Court ladies smiled with politeness but kept their distance, their compliments laced with poison. Beautiful, they would say, but not of pure stock. She learned early that admiration could be as cruel as insult, and that her presence stirred unease in those who believed power belonged only to the true sons of the kingdom. Yet despite the prejudice, she grew into a woman whose strength lay not in rebellion, but in endurance. She endured the stares, the mutters, the questions about her worth. She endured the isolation that came with being both desired and despised. And now she was to endure something greater, the weight of a crown that was not offered in love but in calculation. For the king had chosen her not because of who she was, but because of what her union represented, a merging of noble lines, a claim over families that might otherwise resist him, a tightening of the chains of loyalty that bound his realm. As the announcement of the wedding spread, the kingdom reacted with the same divided heart it had always shown her. The peasants spoke of her beauty, but in the same breath they mocked the taint of her blood. The nobles dressed in finery for the celebration, but behind closed doors they whispered that the throne was being weakened by impurity. Ministers congratulated one another with hollow smiles, knowing the truth, that it was not her presence beside the king that mattered, but her absence beside him on the night of their marriage. Her arrival at the palace was a spectacle. Trumpets blared, soldiers marched, and the people gathered in crowded streets to see the bride. She rode in a carriage draped in crimson silk, her face hidden behind a veil. Yet every glimpse of her, features set tongues wagging. Some praised her as radiant, others muttered about curses. But the loudest sound was not the cheers or the murmurs. It was the silence of those who knew the tradition, the heavy silence that hung over the celebration like a storm waiting to break. Inside the palace, preparations unfolded with the precision of ritual. Seamstresses worked day and night to weave her gown, a garment of ivory and gold meant to display purity and wealth. Priests rehearsed their blessings, their voices echoing through the chapel as though trying to drown out the memory of past brides. Servants polished the halls, laid fresh rushes on the floors, and hung banners bearing the royal crest. Yet beneath the surface of this beauty, tension simmered. For all knew that the wedding was only the beginning, that the true test of her fate would come in darkness, in the silence of a chamber she had never seen. The bride herself moved like a figure caught between two worlds. She smiled when commanded, bowed when required, and spoke in soft tones that gave nothing away. But within her heart, a storm raged. She had heard the whispers of the ritual, heard them from the trembling lips of servants who thought themselves alone, caught fragments of conversation, quickly silenced when she entered a room. Though no one spoke of it openly, she was not blind. She knew that the first night of her marriage did not belong to her husband, but to another. She did not yet understand why, but she felt the weight of dread pressing upon her like iron. On the eve of the wedding, as torches burned through the night and bells rang in the distance, she found herself staring from her chamber window at the darkened sky. The stars seemed distant, cold, indifferent to the fate of mortals. She thought of her mother's words, of endurance, of silence, and wondered if even those lessons would be enough. For what could silence do against a ritual that had broken queens before her? The people celebrated in the streets, drinking and dancing, their laughter a mask for unease. In taverns, the peasants spoke in hushed tones, asking why the king demanded such a ritual, why no bride was spared. Some claimed it was a test of loyalty, others whispered it was an ancient curse placed upon the throne, still others believed it was simply cruelty disguised as tradition. None dared to ask too loudly, for the walls had ears and the king's guards had long memories. And so the night before the wedding passed in restless anticipation. The bride lay awake, her hands trembling beneath the sheets, her thoughts circling, like vultures. She did not yet know the full truth, but she felt its shadow approaching. Every sound in the corridor made her heart quicken. Every flicker of torchlight reminded her that she was not entering a marriage, but a trial. The palace slept uneasily, ministers rehearsing their roles, priests whispering half-hearted prayers, guards patrolling with nervous glances. The city below dreamt of celebration, but in those dreams was the echo of something darker, a memory passed from one generation to the next. For all knew, even if none would say it aloud, when the bells tolled tomorrow the kingdom would see a bride crowned, but when the candles burned low that night, the shadows would claim her first. He was known as the most loyal man in the kingdom, the minister, the shadow who walked behind the throne. To the people he was the face of obedience, the man who bowed lower than all others, who spoke with humility, who executed the king's will without question. But loyalty is a mask, and behind his lay something darker. He had been born not into nobility, but into obscurity. A soldier's son, raised in the barracks, hardened by poverty and humiliation. His rise to power had been slow, relentless, and stained with the kind of ambition that never sleeps. The king had seen that ambition and harnessed it, binding the minister to him with promises of power and privileges others could only dream of. Yet even as the minister kissed the king's ring and carried out his decrees, there lingered a silent hunger in his eyes. For a man who had once had nothing, every new prize only sharpened his thirst for more. And now, in the cruelest of ironies, he was to be given the one thing no servant should ever touch, the king's bride. The wedding day dawned in splendor. Bells rang across the city, their echoes rolling like thunder. Streets overflowed with people dressed in their best, their faces painted with joy and curiosity. The air smelled of roasted meat, spiced wine, and smoke from the torches that lined the roads. Caravans of nobles arrived from distant lands, their carriages painted with coats of arms, their retinues swelling the palace courtyard. To the world, this was a day of celebration. The bride emerged in her gown, a creation of ivory silk embroidered, with threads of gold, her veil shimmering like morning mist. Gasps rose from the crowd as she walked the aisle, her steps measured, her face hidden, but her aura unmistakable. To the peasants, she looked like a vision of purity. To the nobles, she was both a prize and a scandal, a symbol of unity and impurity all at once. The ceremony unfolded in grandeur. Priests raised their voices in blessing, their words echoing in the vaulted hall. Musicians played hymns that mingled with the chanting, the sound swelling until it seemed to shake the very stones of the palace. The king stood tall, his crown gleaming, his face carved into a mask of authority. Beside him the bride bowed her head, her hands trembling beneath layers of silk. Yet beneath the beauty lay unease. The peasants whispered to one another about the ritual to come. "Did you hear what happens tonight?" one man muttered to another. "The minister will—" His voice trailed off, his courage failing him. Women shook their heads, some out of pity for the bride, others out of fear that such a fate could befall their daughters. Nobles pretended ignorance, but their eyes gleamed with the cruel delight of those who knew a secret others dared not speak. The minister himself stood among them, expression unreadable. He watched the bride with the calm detachment of a man accustomed to playing his part. To those who looked upon him, he was nothing but the king's instrument. Yet within his chest, his heart beat with a rhythm of fire. For tonight, power would pass through him in a way no crown or throne could ever provide. He told himself it was duty, that he obeyed the king as always, but in the deepest corners of his soul, he knew the truth. He desired what was forbidden. And the king had opened the door for him. The vows were spoken, the blessings given. A cheer rose from the crowd as the marriage was declared complete. Wine flowed, tables groaned under feasts, and dancers filled the courtyards. To the people, it was a day of triumph. Yet even as laughter filled the air, the palace walls seemed to tighten, their shadows lengthening with every passing hour. As night approached, torches were lit in the halls, their flames casting flickering patterns on ancient stone. The bride was led away, her veil still covering her face, her steps slow and hesitant. Servants whispered prayers under their breath as they passed her, their eyes avoiding hers. She felt their pity, their fear, and it weighed heavier than the crown upon her head. The king did not follow her. He remained in the great hall, drinking with his ministers, his laughter echoing through the corridors. It was tradition, after all. No king had ever broken it. No bride had ever been spared. The minister was summoned. He walked with steady steps, his face composed, though within him every nerve burned. Guards opened doors before him, servants bowed as he passed, and yet the silence that followed him was deafening. It was as though the palace itself recoiled from what was about to take place. The tied-old bride sat waiting in the bridal chamber, its walls hung with crimson tapestries, its bed draped in silks. Candles burned low, their light trembling like frightened hearts. She sat with her veil still in place, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had prayed for a miracle, for some force to intervene, but none had come. And now the door opened. The minister entered, his shadow stretching across the floor. For a moment, he stood still, his gaze fixed upon her. The air between them was heavy with unspoken truths, the cruelty of the king, the helplessness of the bride, the ambition of the servant. Outside, the palace feasted and celebrated, but within these walls, another truth prepared to unfold. The door closed. The sound of laughter in the distance faded into silence. And in that silence, the fate of the bride, the power of the king, and the secret of the kingdom's darkest ritual converged into a single, shattering moment. The chamber was silent, save for the faint crackle of candle flames. Shadows danced across the crimson tapestries, their movements restless, as though they sensed the darkness about to unfold. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, meant to purify, yet it only suffocated. On the bed sat the bride, her veil lowered, her heart thundering so violently she feared it might betray her fear to the man standing at the threshold. The minister entered with slow, deliberate steps. His boots struck the polished floor like the tolling of a bell. For a moment, he stood still, watching her with eyes neither kind nor cruel, only calculating. He was a servant, yes, but tonight he carried a power that no crown could grant. The king had given him permission, and that permission was more terrible than any command. She raised her eyes to him, and in them flickered a desperate plea. She did not speak, it was forbidden, but her silence screamed louder than words. Her body trembled beneath the weight of silk, her hands clutched the folds of her gown until her fingers ached. In that moment she was no queen, no bride, no jewel of the realm. She was prey, cornered in a gilded cage. The minister's chest tightened. He had taken lives on the battlefield without hesitation. He had crushed rivals in court without remorse. Yet here, standing before a trembling girl cloaked in innocence and fear, something within him stirred. It was not mercy. It was hunger. A hunger that his ambition tried to disguise as loyalty. He told himself he was obeying the king, that this ritual was not of his making. He told himself it was tradition, a duty thrust upon him. But deep within he knew the truth. He had dreamed of this moment, though he had never dared to admit it. And now the king had granted him the unthinkable. Outside, the palace roared with music and laughter. Nobles feasted, peasants sang, and the city burned with celebration. But behind these walls, silence devoured sound. No one would enter. No one would stop what was to unfold. For generations, this ritual had repeated itself. Brides sacrificed to prove their submission, to remind them that their bodies belong not to love, but to power. The bride tried to steady her breath, but her chest rose and fell like a bird, trapped in a storm. Her thoughts spiraled. Why had the king chosen this? Was it distrust of her, hatred of her blood, or was it a cruelty designed to remind her that even in marriage she would never belong to herself? She remembered the whispers of servants, their voices trembling with pity. No bride is spared, they had said. The first night belongs not to the king, but to the one he commands. Some said it was a test of loyalty, to see if the minister would resist temptation. Others said it was a curse passed down from ancient rulers, meant to bind every queen in humiliation. But she knew in her heart that it was something darker, a weapon forged from prejudice and power. The minister removed his cloak and laid it across a chair. The sound of the fabric against wood was louder than thunder in her ears. Every motion he made was deliberate, slow, heavy with meaning. She could not look away. Her body stiffened, her hands locked together, her lips moving in silent prayer. In the corridors outside, guards shifted uneasily. They knew what was happening, yet none dared speak. It was not their place to question the king's command. Ministers in the great hall raised their cups, pretending not to think of the ritual, though their eyes betrayed curiosity and satisfaction. And among the nobles whispers turned cruel. Let her learn what she is. Let her know she was never pure enough. The bride's heart splintered. She was not only being stripped of dignity, she was being sacrificed to the hatred of those who saw her as less than worthy. This was not only about loyalty, it was about blood, about heritage, about reminding her that she carried a stain in the eyes of the court. The ritual was more than cruelty. It was racism carved into tradition, enforced through silence, perfected through repetition. The minister stepped closer, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air before lowering slowly toward her veil. For a breathless moment he hesitated. Duty warred with desire, obedience clashed with ambition. He could still turn back, he could still resist, but the weight of the king's will crushed every thought of mercy. The veil slipped from her face, candlelight revealed her tears, shining like shards of glass. Her beauty, undeniable, only deepened the cruelty of the moment. The minister's breath caught, not with compassion but with possession. He saw not a queen, not a bride, but a prize handed to him by the king himself. The chamber grew colder, as though the walls themselves recoiled. The bride shut her eyes, her soul retreating into silence. She had no voice, no shield, no escape. Outside, the bells tolled, marking the passing of another hour of celebration. Inside, the ritual edged closer to its cruel fulfillment. And somewhere, unseen yet ever present, the king laughed. Whether in truth or in memory, his laughter echoed in the bride's mind, for this was his design, not love, not union, but humiliation. And through it, he would bind her in chains invisible yet unbreakable. The first act of the ritual had begun. The veil lay forgotten on the floor, its threads of gold dim against the crimson carpet. The minister stood above her, his breath slow, measured, deliberate. The chamber's silence was so complete that even the distant roar of the feast seemed swallowed by the walls. For the bride, time fractured, each heartbeat stretched into eternity, each breath a desperate struggle to hold on to the fragments of dignity still clutched within her trembling hands. The minister's hand hovered in the air, as though he were holding the weight of centuries. He told himself again and again, "This is not my choice. This is the king's will. This is tradition." Yet those words, repeated like prayer, began to twist into something darker. This is my right, this is my reward. What began as obedience slid inch by inch into possession. She sat motionless, her tears unacknowledged, her silence weaponized against her. To resist was to risk her life. To cry out was to bring shame upon her family. The chains of power had been laid long before she entered this room, chains forged by kings, priests, and nobles who had perfected cruelty into ritual. Her body was not her own, her fate not hers to command. Outside, whispers spread like wildfire. The nobles drank deeply, their laughter edged with cruelty. "So it begins," one muttered to another, their voices dripping with contempt. "Let her learn her place." Among the peasants, unease grew. Mothers clutched their daughters, fearing the world their children would inherit. Men whispered about curses, about the blood of outsiders bringing ruin upon the realm. Racism wrapped itself around the story like a serpent, tightening with every retelling. The minister lowered himself closer, his shadow consuming her small form. Within his chest a battle raged. He had been a servant his whole life, bending his knee, kissing the king's hand, obeying without question. Tonight, for the first time, he was not servant but master. The power coursed through him like fire, intoxicating, undeniable, and as he yielded to it, something inside him shifted. He was no longer only fulfilling the king's will, he was savoring it. The bride's world blurred. She felt herself collapsing inward, fleeing into the corners of her mind where the king's shadow could not follow. In those hidden places, she remembered her mother's words, "Endure, survive." But endurance was no shield against the ritual's cruelty. Survival meant silence, and silence was its own kind of death. The ritual was not meant to break her body. It was meant to break her soul, and in that it succeeded. Far away in the great hall, the king raised a goblet, his laughter booming above the music. To him, this night was not about love, not about loyalty. It was about control. Each bride who entered his palace became a queen in name only, her authority stripped before it could bloom. The ritual ensured that no woman, No outsider, no drop of blood he deemed impure could ever challenge him. By giving her to another, he claimed her completely. By humiliating her, he crushed her before she could rise. For the king, cruelty was not weakness. It was governance. It was a lesson written into flesh and memory, and it was a tradition that none dared defy. The night dragged on, each moment heavier than the last. When the minister finally emerged from the chamber, his face was calm, composed, unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him. They gleamed with a hunger newly fed, with ambition newly emboldened. He had tasted a power forbidden to all but kings, and it had left a mark upon him that no loyalty could erase. Servants bowed as he passed, but their gazes lingered. They knew what had transpired, and though they said nothing, their silence was louder than words. Some pitied the bride, others envied the minister, but all understood. The ritual had been fulfilled once more. The bride remained behind, broken in ways the court would never see. Tomorrow she would appear at the king's side, her crown gleaming, her face composed. But behind her eyes would linger the memory of this night, the humiliation etched into her soul. She had been transformed, not into a queen, but into a symbol of obedience, a warning to any who might dream of resistance. And in the shadows of the palace, the minister stood alone, his thoughts fevered. He had obeyed, yes, but he had also indulged, and that indulgence whispered to him now, louder than the king's voice. Why serve when one could rule? The palace slept uneasily, the feast dying into silence, the torches burning low. Yet in that silence the seeds of rebellion, hatred and despair took root. The bride lay awake, her heart shattered, her eyes burning. The minister paced in his chamber, tasting ambition for the first time, and the king, drunk with power, laughed in his triumph, blind to the storm he had unleashed. For this was no mere ritual. It was the birth of a tragedy, one that would unravel not just a marriage but a kingdom. The morning after the ritual dawned like a cruel parody of hope. Sunlight spilled across the palace, painting the marble walls with gold, yet inside the queen's chambers lay a silence so heavy it strangled the air. The bride sat before a mirror, her crown newly placed upon her head, her skin flawless beneath the powder of the court's attendants. To any observer, she looked regal, composed, untouchable, but the reflection staring back at her was not her own. It was a mask, sculpted by fear. Behind the painted smile hid hollow eyes. She had not slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt again the minister's shadow, the weight of humiliation, the cruelty of being stripped of dignity before she could even begin her reign. Her crown felt like iron shackles. When she entered the great hall beside the king, the nobles rose in admiration. Their applause thundered like waves crashing against stone, but beneath that thunder ran another sound, whispers, whispers that slid between lips like poison. She has already been touched. The king is clever. He will never share his throne with her. Do you see how she walks? As if hollowed out. The whispers stung sharper than knives, for they confirmed the truth. The ritual had achieved its purpose. She was no queen. She was a warning. The minister stood among the courtiers, his face carefully blank. Yet inside fire roared. The taste of power lingered in his veins, intoxicating, unforgettable. No longer did he bow with the same humility. No longer did he see himself as mere servant. He had touched what only kings touched. He had claimed what only rulers claimed, and the knowledge of that truth pulsed within him like a secret too great to contain. The king, oblivious, basked in his glory. He raised a goblet, his laughter booming across the hall. To him last night had been victory, a reaffirmation of his dominance, his cruelty sharpened into tradition. He had broken another bride, and in doing so had reminded his court of their place. But arrogance blinded him to the fissures spreading beneath his throne. For outside the palace walls, unrest stirred. The peasants whispered of curses, of kings who brought ruin upon their people by desecrating sacred bonds. Among the slaves and servants, stories grew, stories of brides destroyed, of innocents sacrificed. Racism, already a rot at the heart of the kingdom, festered deeper as those deemed outsiders bore the brunt of cruelty. The bride felt it too. Each step she took beside the king was not just her humiliation. It was a reflection of the kingdom's sickness. She was living proof of what power could do to the powerless. Yet within her brokenness a spark remained, silent, trembling, but alive. A spark that whispered, "If he can shatter me, then I too can shatter him." That night she stood alone on the balcony, the cold air biting her skin. Below, the city lay restless, its alleys whispering rebellion. Behind her, the door opened, and the minister stepped into the light. Their eyes met, hers heavy with despair, his with unspoken hunger. For the first time she saw him not just as the man who had stolen her dignity, but as another prisoner of the king's cruelty. A prisoner who had begun to believe his chains were wings. And in that dangerous silence, an unspoken alliance flickered. The king, secure in his arrogance, did not see it. He did not hear the shift in the minister's voice when he addressed him with less humility. He did not see the bride's eyes no longer hollow but calculating. He did not feel the storm gathering within his own court, where whispers grew bolder each night. The ritual that was meant to ensure loyalty and obedience had instead sown seeds of betrayal, seeds that would soon split open and unleash chaos. The king believed he had won. In truth, he had lit the fuse of his own downfall. The court glittered, with feasts, wine, and music, but behind the golden velvet, a sickness gnawed at its heart. Each day the king grew louder, crueler, more certain of his untouchable power. Each day the bride wore her crown with greater silence, her stillness a mask that hid a storm. And each day the minister drifted further from obedience, intoxicated by the memory of a night that had changed everything. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into truths. The minister is too bold, some muttered. The queen no longer fears. Others spoke of omens, of storms gathering over the kingdom, of a divine punishment for rulers who twisted justice into humiliation. The king laughed at them all. One night during a banquet meant to celebrate the strength of the throne, the king, drunk with pride, summoned his bride to stand before the hall. He demanded she raise her cup and thank him for the honor of being broken. Gasps filled the air, but none dared move. The bride's hand trembled, her lips pressed tight. For a moment it seemed she would refuse, but then her eyes shifted, not to the king but to the minister. And in that fleeting glance, something passed between them, an unspoken pact, dangerous and undeniable. The minister stepped forward, offering to fill her cup. His voice rang with a confidence that made the nobles stiffen. "Her queen should never tremble," he said, pouring the wine. "She should be remembered for her strength." The hall froze. The king's laughter faltered. In those words lay defiance, thinly veiled, but sharp enough to draw blood. That night, the king summoned the minister to his chambers. Shadows clung to the walls as he demanded loyalty, demanded proof that his ritual had worked. But the minister's silence was heavy, suffocating. For the first time, the king sensed the cracks in his own design. The ritual had not bound his minister, it had unleashed him. Meanwhile, the bride, alone in her chamber, wrote by candlelight. Not letters of love, but a record of cruelty. A confession of what had been done to her and to the women before her. She hid the parchment among the servants, knowing it would spread like fire once discovered. Her suffering would not remain a whisper, it would become a weapon. By dawn, unrest shook the city. Servants whispered of rebellion, nobles questioned the king's sanity, and in the great hall, when the king appeared to address his court, he found not awe, but unease. Eyes turned toward the minister, who no longer bowed, and toward the queen, who no longer hid her gaze. The ritual meant to ensure dominance had instead birthed defiance. The king stood on his throne, blind to the truth. His greatest cruelty had become the instrument of his undoing. As his voice thundered across the hall, swearing loyalty and demanding obedience, no one noticed how his words rang hollow. No one. But the queen, whose silence was no longer submission, but the sharpening of a blade. The king had won his ritual, but in winning, he had already lost his kingdom. The storm that had been brewing in silence finally broke. It began not with swords or fire, but with words, her words. The parchment the bride had hidden among the servants slipped into the hands of peasants, merchants, and nobles alike. It spread like a living flame, telling the truth of the ritual, the cruelty masked as tradition, the humiliation that had crushed countless women before her. For centuries these stories had been whispered in shadows. Now they were shouted in the open. The palace could no longer contain the anger. Women wept and raged, men muttered in shame, and even the loyal nobles began to question the king. The ritual, once seen as power, was revealed as sickness. The minister stood at the center of it all. For the first time he tasted what it meant to hold true power, not the borrowed power of a knight, but the raw force of a kingdom ready to rebel. His loyalty to the king crumbled. His ambition burned brighter. And though he was complicit, though his hands were stained, the people looked to him as the crack through which justice might break the throne. The king, blind with fury, thundered against them all. He called his queen a liar, his minister a traitor, his people ungrateful. But each word rang emptier than the last. His cruelty, once awe-inspiring, now revealed his weakness. He was not a ruler. He was a coward who hid his fear behind rituals of humiliation. And the queen, once trembling, once broken, stood before him in silence. Her silence no longer meant submission. It meant judgment. In her gaze lay the weight of every bride who had been sacrificed, every woman silenced, every soul crushed under the pretense of tradition. She had become the voice of all of them. The climax came not with blood but with abandonment. One by one, the nobles lowered their heads. The minister refused to kneel. The guards dropped their spears. And in the echoing hall the king stood alone, surrounded by the ruins of his own design. The ritual had been his crown. Now it was his noose. Outside the people chanted, not for war, not for conquest, but for truth, for justice, for an end to the darkness that had hidden behind royal walls. The queen's words became their anthem. A throne built on humiliation cannot stand. A kingdom built on cruelty cannot last. And so it was. The king's downfall was not a dramatic beheading, nor a fiery revolt. It was slower, quieter, more devastating. His throne crumbled beneath the weight of silence. His reign dissolved in the absence of loyalty. His name remembered not as mighty, but as monstrous. The queen remained, not as a ruler, but as a symbol. Her crown was no longer iron but flame. She carried with her the memory of injustice, the scars of humiliation, but she turned them into weapons sharper than swords. Her story echoed across centuries. It reminded the world of the danger of power when wielded without conscience, of the horror born when human dignity is traded for dominance. It reminded them that racism and cruelty, no matter how deeply woven into tradition, always rot the throne they claim to protect. And as the tale ends, one truth remains. The king believed he owned his bride. He believed he owned his minister. He believed he owned his people. But in the end he owned nothing, not even his own legacy. For history does not honor those who break others. It honors those who rise from the breaking.